Okay, Simon, show me what you have in relation to peak oil.
Okay, so this is actually some work done by Art Berman that actually shows our predicament. So let me share my screen. I'm actually presenting this sort of information to groups around the world at the moment, and what I'm finding is they're getting it. So let me just, can you see that? Can you see the presentation?
Yes.
Okay, so this is total liquids production, and we've got a peak at November 2018. And about a year later, we had the COVID lockdowns, which is this dip here. But things
This
have
is
climbed up
world
pretty
oil production, and Simon
liquids,
and
total
others,
liquids,
total
total liquids.
liquids. Okay.
Right. So what does total liquids actually mean? Because we think, oil means gasoline. That's not the case. So this is the work that Art has done. This is the same data, but now we've actually unpacked it by source. The blue is actually crude oil, crude oil products. We've got
Mhm.
a peak in November 2018, and it's gone down and it's not coming back. So I do believe November 2018 actually was peak oil,
Yeah.
but oil doesn't equal gasoline. So what Art has shown over time, we've seen things improve, right? Where more and more oil, like 40% of what's coming out of the United States in particular, is based on natural gas converted to gasoline. Now, that makes sense, but calorifically, it's very expensive. The energy return on energy investment ratio is much different to oil. So this is the ultimate Red Queen problem. And so the rate of change that we're seeing looks like total liquids might actually exceed the November 2018 target. And people say,
Yeah.
hooray, it's done. But actually, we genuinely do have peak oil because we're not using oil so much anymore. The problem is we are sweating out too much of the tight oil systems in the United States. So that's going to crash, and it's going to crash pretty hard and fast for the
So
gas
the
industry.
upshot of this is that the numbers we are routinely presented with really need to be adjusted. Art Berman has gone through and has adjusted these numbers to something that is more useful.
Yeah, he's unpacked it, and there's a YouTube he's got called the hedonistic adjustment with Nate Hagens, right? And he goes through this chart, and it actually has evolved the concept of peak oil. Because if we don't understand this, we're going to get caught flat-footed. Because what it means is we're going to see a pretty steep drop-off when gas becomes unreliable, when one sector in particular cannot deliver. This same chart, by the way, if we go back to
What's the ripple effect? What's the chain reaction that you're talking about there?
okay, so petroleum products like gasoline represents about
40%.
uh, 40%, but gasoline products, 90% of the products around us require some kind of gasoline or diesel product to actually get from one place to another or to be manufactured.
Mm-hmm.
So when we actually sort of stop having that entire logistical chain, all of a sudden we'll have some short-term difficulties of unprecedented nature. Gas, on the other hand, is also how we run most of our industry. So if we're depleting our gas in exchange for what was normally done for oil, then we're actually depleting both fronts at the same time without realizing it. And so when they do roll over, they're going to deplete and crash really fast.
Hmm.
Right. So what we call peak oil
At what
is no
stage of the
longer.
process are they going to crash? Is it the process of extraction? Is it valuation in the supply
so
chain, or what?
so I think we've got the problem of available capital investment, because to keep the tight oil sector, you need to constantly drill new stuff.
Mhm.
But you've got to be smart about the drilling. What they're doing instead is they're drilling to get the most amount of product out, and so they're sweating their deposits for short-term gain in exchange for a shorter long-term life. Right, so they're keeping their businesses
Mhm.
alive
Okay.
in exchange for destroying what they could get.
That's
And
another
so,
reason for kind of a precipitous drop rather than an incremental decline.
yeah, so if we hit economic problems this year, and the tight oil sector in the United States in particular cannot operate the same way, right, then that will crash hard. So what that chart is showing, that what we call peak oil is no longer the only thing we have to watch. We also have to watch, for example, total liquids and the role of biofuels, which is the orange, and the yellow, which is natural gas being converted to gasoline. But if you look at the blue, oil's not coming back. That is actually, I believe we're going to get to November 2023 and that we won't actually get there. But what do we really need in terms of oil? And it's the available gasoline and available diesel. And so technology has been used to get it from another source, but hasn't really been discussed. And Art's put this together, but all the analysts, for example, at BP Stats, they haven't actually taken the time to show this. And I think if it was truly understood, it would be understood that whether peak oil really was in 2018 or whether total liquids actually will crash in a year or two's time or 5 years' time even, the change required to change oil out and replace it with something else is going to be enormous. But it's around
correct
now.
me if I'm wrong, but oil company executives and CEOs, shareholders, board members, they're incentivized to keep quiet about the short supplies, because if they said something about it, their stock price would go down.
I think it's something like that, but I also think that if discussions of peak oil was discussed frankly in the literature without being encouraged not to happen, if that really was the case and the average person was to understand this, then I think the trust placed in the corporate system and the money system in particular would be damaged to the point where it's no longer viable. So there's actually something else on this chart. See this point here in around January 2005, oil production plateaued. You got this plateau here. So for a short period of time, this was before fracking was a big thing. For a short period of time, Saudi Arabia was the swing producer of the world. Their production plateaued, and so they tried to bring more capacity online, and they couldn't. So they brought
the plateau on your graph.
Okay, so look at January 2000. Can you see the arrow? Can you see the arrow?
See the arrow.
In January 2005.
Yeah. Okay. All right.
Okay, see that little plateau there?
Right.
For a short period of time, supply and demand separated. The Saudis could not bring more fuel online. They just couldn't do it. And so for a short period of time, remember the oil price spike of 2008? It just rocketed up. That speculation bubble was because it plateaued, but demand went up anyway. So that put the pressure on everything.
Part of the reason for the 2008 financial crisis, that's kind of a trigger.
So I believe what happened there is it put the whole system under strain in 2005, and you see the blowout in the metal price, right? And that later then triggered the GFC, and oil price was the marker for that. And ever since then, they've been using quantitative easing to hold it all together. So yeah, and so this is the conundrum that we sort of find ourselves in.
So what's the upshot of that? Like, explain your graph in like a couple sentences to sum it up.
So what we're sort of seeing here is we did see a peak in production a few years ago. Oil is declining, but now we're using a much more expensive source called natural gas to supplant oil to produce gasoline in particular, but also diesel. And in doing so, we're actually sweating more out of the resource sooner, which means when we do roll over,
commonly known. I mean,
yeah.
I at least speaking for myself and probably for the general public, it's not commonly known that these raw materials can, to some extent, substitute for one another.
Some can. So let me show you where that is seen elsewhere. See, this is metal price. So what you're looking at here is the metal price as seen by the World Bank: base metals, precious metals, oil, gas, and coal. And what I've done is indexed the data go back to 1960 in a monthly resolution to the number 100 and December 2001.
So this graph shows aluminum or aluminum, iron ore, copper,
lead, tin,
nickel,
nickel.
zinc, lots of metals. And
So all the stuff the World Bank uses to test the health of the industrial system. So you're seeing periods of stability. So we had a period of stability prior to 2005, and after 2005, that happened.
Are these prices?
These are prices. These are market prices. And we've indexed it to number 100 to overlay the curve. So what you're
since
seeing,
2005, the prices of all these things are very volatile.
And they've blown out. And you might notice the global financial crisis is there in the dip. And whatever that big economic correction was not enough to resolve the volatility. So whatever this is, it actually is still there. It's structural, not speculation. So that January 2005 is oil production plateauing, like I showed you. And so what I call is the GFC was triggered by something that started in the economic in the oil market in 2005 that put the system under such pressure that when everything broke in 2008, and then we patched it up with quantitative easing. And while we're here, I'll show you this one. Oil and...
Can we go back to the last one just a minute?
Yeah, sure. So
when prices go up, if supply is not a problem, then supply goes up. But if there's a bottleneck in the supply, then that's a problem. Then prices stay high, but anyway.
Yeah, so the oil price spiked, and that made everything else go up.
Okay.
Right. And so the link is a bit more complex than that.
Okay.
But so you do have correlation, and the oil production plateau to me is actually what actually triggered that.
So the fact that oil could not all of a sudden, when oil plateaus, that means we're not able to meet increased demand.
Yep, correct. So I've got a slide that puts this together. The next one is if we put oil and GDP and we from back to 1965 and we start them at 100. In the beginning, oil was physical work. Physical work was economic.
Let me get this graph. You've got 0 to 2,500 in something value.
Hang on. So that's the full graph.
Okay.
So it's an index value against year. So what I've done.
What years are we dealing with?
1965 to 2021.
Okay.
So
global GDP compared to oil production.
Where they're both indexed to 100.
One of them is flat. Total world oil production is flat while GDP is going up.
So this is actually indexed to the number 100 to the 1965. So the curves are overlaid, so they start from the same point. Now, the red line is relatively flat because the blue line has expanded so much. Right, so in 1971, the US dollar decouples from the gold standard, and they can print money to solve their problems. And then we got the petrodollar agreement, which forces the rest of the world to interact with this system.
So when we say that the economy keeps going up, we're talking about GDP, which is a function of the number of dollars flowing.
Yep.
Even though those dollars might be declining in value, the question is how much.
So now we're talking about, well, gosh, there's a 17 scalar there. So what happens when that actually corrects? So now let me see if I can find. No, I don't have it.
So what's the moral of the story of this? This blue line and the red line are diverging from each other. What's the moral of that story?
So in 1971, the real economy diverged from the fiat economy, the fake economy, the virtual economy. Mm-hmm. And we have believed the virtual economy was reality and our metric for success. But what we don't realize is the real economy is now in trouble.
And we're saying it's a virtual economy because it's printing money. And
printing
it's money not tied to anything. I mean, it's money tied to the price of oil, but not money tied to the real economy, arguably.
Yeah, and so it's not actually backed by a physical constant. And to balance the budget, they can just print money, and over the time they've done that. And in fact, let me show you the next slide. Actually, no, I've stopped sharing. So this one here, I actually presented to the IMF, and they actually let me do it.
IMF is
and
International Monetary Fund, one of
so
the main arms of the U.S. central bank. It's supposed to be international, but it's controlled by the U.S.
And I when I came out of this, am I going to get in trouble for this? So
Quantitative easing is another word for printing money.
yeah, it's the polite version. It's the polite. They say it's not the same thing, but actually it is. The invention of numbers on a screen called money. Right. So what I've done here is put together the civilian actions for the United States, because it's the world reserve currency, for all the civilian actions that are worth spending money on, like the race to the moon in 1973 cost $25.4 billion at the time. And just that for inflation in 2018 dollars, that's $145 billion.
Listen up. This is good, because he's going to compare the amount of money it took to go to the moon versus the money we're throwing around today.
Yeah, watch this for a game of soldiers. So here is that top graph now fits into the bottom graph in the top left-hand corner. The red is the war economy. This is the money that has been spent on various wars up until, the Iraq war. This is the stuff they're prepared to admit. Obviously, there's other actions happening.
Gulf War, Korean War, Vietnam War, Afghanistan War, Iraq War. The dollars, there's going from 100 billion to 300 billion to 500 billion to 700 billion to 800 billion is the amounts of money we're throwing around for these wars. And compare that with the moonshot and other things. What else are we comparing it to?
Here is
Louisiana Purchase.
Yeah. So now we're going. Red and blue now fits into the top left-hand corner of the bottom graph. We've got QE1, QE2, and QE3, which is how we responded, or how the Fed responded to the global financial crisis. So the money they put into that dwarfs everything else seen so far. But wait, there's more. I know you want more.
But wait, let's talk about these numbers. Don't go yet.
Okay. Yeah.
So got $500 billion for what are those? I can't read the numbers in the bottom.
Okay, so let's go back to the race to the moon cost $145 billion in 2018 dollars.
2018 dollars.
Okay, the Iraq War from 2003 to 2018 cost $800 billion.
Okay.
Right. So, and then
so far.
so far. Yeah. Well, it's over, right? Right.
Right.
So,
right.
So QE1 was a little more, I think it was 2.1 trillion.
Right.
And that was applied.
QE1, you're talking about quantitative easing in what time frame?
November 2008 to June 2010.
So 2008. So the quantitative easing that occurred on the heels of the financial crisis of 2008.
Yep. Right. And then we had 3 applications before that. And then it's all right, it's over. We're done. Right. But now they've actually learned this new trick. Right. Then there was the repo crisis of 2017, which was a bank liquidity crisis that could have crashed everything. But the purple bar down the bottom is the US COVID relief package that was applied in 15 months, 5.2 trillion in 3 stages, adjusted to 2018 US dollars.
All right, what was there were like 2 different stages of that. I forget the CARES Act was the first one.
There was 3 stages, and when you add the 3 stages together, we got more than 5 trillion. So the US dollar, the US government in 2008 was only about 7 trillion in debt, 7 or 8 trillion, I forget which. Now it's past 30 trillion. It was 31 trillion or something like that. And
from 2008 to the present, the debt has gone from 7 trillion to what?
To 31 trillion.
31 trillion.
Right, and they've hit the debt ceiling again. And so this is what I call the road to Zimbabwe.
So somebody said the West spends and China lends. They're lending us money and lending us money and lending us money.
Until we sanction them, and let's go to war with them and see how that works.
Right. Yeah.
Dumbasses. So this is the graph that shows that we are a petroleum-dominated society. Gross domestic product is on the x-axis, and total liquids consumption of gasoline is on the y-axis.
So this shows the correlation between the economy as measured by GDP
Yep.
and the total production and consumption of energy. They're
Of gasoline.
strongly correlated.
0.92 R squared. So what
Yeah.
this shows is
0.92, where 1 is perfect correlation,
yeah,
0.92 is almost perfect correlation.
yep. And so there are all the big European countries. There's United States, and there's the BRICS nations. And there's all the Nordic countries, which I'm interested in. So what this shows is large GDP means large oil consumption or gasoline consumption. Low GDP means low gasoline consumption. We are a petroleum-driven society.
We are, and one upshot of this is that you can, I say, so-called renewable energy is a fantasy. That might be harsh and extreme, but there's a lot of fantasy involved in it. Am I wrong about that? I don't want to be dogmatic or anything like that.
All absolutist statements are not useful. You could say that renewable energy won't work as well as we think, and is only part of the solution, not the solution. That's probably a more comfortable way to say it.
Right. So, and it takes fossil fuels in order to build. You've said that it shouldn't be called renewable energy. It should be called rebuildable energy, because the sun keeps shining, but it takes a machine to harvest that energy. The wind is going to blow, but it takes a machine, and the machine has to be built. And then after a period of useful life, it has to be rebuilt.
That's a Nate Hagen's term, but yes, they're not replaced. They're replaceables or rebuildables, but they're not renewable. And that's the elephant in the room. Anyway, all right. So I could go on all night. So yeah.
Well, that's a really good segment. We'll end it here, and I'll put that on YouTube.
I could show you oil discovery versus who's peaked and who's still increasing.
Then let's do it.
Let's do it. All right. Rock, rhythm, and roll. All right. I didn't want to overrun. So this chart is oil discoveries historically. And you might notice we are actually, most of the oil was discovered in the 60s and the 70s. That's the Gawa deposit, that big long one there. I'll come back to that. So while production keeps going up, most of the discoveries happened in our past. Now here's the same data. John Peach put this together. He's another competent oil analyst. So the red on the chart on the left, the red is discoveries, and the green is the blue is production cumulatively, and the green is taking one from the other. And what you come from that is two things. First, the net addition to inventory peaked in 1985, and since then things have been declining. The second thing is half of the oil ever extracted and used has been extracted since 1992.
This is a little bit of a foreign language to me, at least. So there's annual production, there's discovery, there's annual production, and what else?
In the cumulative sense, and with like the net gain to inventory. This how much are we discovering and how much are we using? Like for every barrel of oil that we discover, we're using 3 or 4. And the quality of oil now is much lower than what it was before. So the last little, how things gone. So here's how things gone for the last decade or so. And we're discovering less and less. There was a record, 81% of existing oil fields are declining, and they're declining at a range of 5 to 7%.
So this is something that I've heard, and I try to get my head around it. But there's discovery, and then there's the decline. So to maintain oil production, you have to have more and more and more discovery. If you don't have more and more and more discovery, then production is going to be limited.
Yeah, we're tapping into our historical reserves. We have an enormous amount of oil left, right? But we're using an enormous amount of oil, and this is the problem. Our ability to bring more to market and expand is the problem. It's not that we've run out of oil. So most of the oil productions are declining in production. And so we're having to bring more stuff online to keep up. right? So of the largest, there's about 20 elephant fields that produce most of our oil. Of the largest 10, the youngest was discovered in 1976. So only a few countries are still expanding. So this was 2022 data. 2023's just come out, and so I've got to update all these. Great. So in this, we've only got Russia, Iraq, UAE, Canada, and the United States were still expanding. You might see this peak at the top. That could be an artifact of COVID.
Is
COVID-19
that
has
expansion partly due to fracking?
Yes, the fracking is the tight oil sector, is the red along the top with a vertical bars through it. The Canadian tar sands are the yellow with the yellow vertical bars through it. So unconventional oil is actually holding all new growth.
Yeah.
So that peak at the top could be an artifact for COVID.
So
COVID
there's
has
no growth without unconventional methods of extraction.
Yep.
One thing Nate Hagen says is that, fracking, for example, it widens the straw temporarily, but soon that straw is going to be slurping.
That is true, right? And so we're in deeper shit than usual when it comes to depending on fracking, because the party's almost over. So COVID has proven to be the perfect camouflage.
Well, let me ask you real quick: is fracking profitable?
That's an interesting question. Some people say it is, and some people say it actually loses money. Right. So it depends on what part of the value chain you're in.
Like if it weren't being subsidized, that would seem to be part of the reason that people are doing it, even though arguably it's not profitable.
So
like
there's
loan guarantees, for example, as a form of subsidy.
Yeah. So there's a lot of it is like, what do you mean by subsidy? There's a lot of discussion around that.
Right.
There is a school of thought that fracking has not actually produced enough profit to justify setting it up in the first place. But the derivatives market, oil futures are the most commonly traded action on the planet. Right. And so what's real and what's not real? And I don't have the education to untangle all that. Let's just say it probably is not a good business to be in long term. You can make a lot of money in the early part, but a lot of people are going to lose money. So in spite of COVID's proven to be the perfect camouflage for peak oil. We were just about to find out what would happen in the market. Window closed, and then we got the pandemic.
And so we can blame the downturn on the pandemic and not talk about peak oil for a little while until we discover that, hey, 2018 was peak oil.
You've got it. And peak oil, 2018, that's about a year before COVID kicked off. So just as we had the data coming in and we just, look at that. Now we've got something else to look at. Yeah, right. So call me cynical. So only the United States conventional oil and Canadian tar sands were expanding in production. All other sources were contracting, but some of that could be COVID. So if the United States and Iraq were excluded, peak oil production would have happened in 2016. Right. Everyone else is in decline.
Because the United States doing fracking and Canada doing tar sands is, if you take that out and leave it to the rest, then peak oil was even earlier than we're speculating.
That's
2016.
Right. That's right. So if you take Iraq and United States out, peak oil was 2016. If you didn't have fracking and tight oil, peak oil would have been somewhere like on the plateau of 2005. After I think there was a record in 2011 because the price of oil went up and more resources were available. So peak oil would be considerably earlier than without tight oil and without tar sands. But everyone else in the world...
Tight oil is another word for what we get from fracking.
That's correct. That's correct. And our fracking's been around since the 50s, but in 2008, there was an evolution in drilling horizontally, where they could do it with precision. And because fracking is a much poorer quality resource, right? So the normal way of just setting a vertical well and just pumping it out doesn't work. You've got to actually drill into these oil shale deposits and do a thing where you pump water and sand in there and then set off an explosion to set off cracks, and through those cracks you get more oil. But each fracked oil well doesn't last very long compared to conventional oil. Like after 36 months of production, they've dropped 90%, as a general example. So they've got to keep drilling more. And Richard Heinberg called it the treadmill from hell, because they've got to keep drilling thousands of wells just to keep producing. It's like the Red Queen problem. So everywhere else is declining, including Saudi Arabia.
Speaking of Richard Heinberg, I was just reading him this morning, and he was saying, this book I was reading is from the early 2000s, and he was, or maybe it was 2010 or something. He was saying peak oil had been in 2005, but that was before the fracking boom.
Yeah, so peak oil production, there was one school of thought that peak oil happened in 2005, and that was true, right? But then fracking happened and unconventional oil came on board, and that saved everything, and that drove the price up. And so resources that weren't previously economic were able to be brought online. And so the true record for conventional oil was 2011. But Richard was right. It was just someone invented a technology that didn't exist before. Like someone pulled a rabbit out of the hat and it worked. So Richard does excellent work in understanding, what are the implications of an oil-free society. Now, he's done a number of books which are quite good. So Saudi Arabia is the hot pink bar on the chart on the right. That's offended a few of the Saudi Arabians. Sorry about that. But the conventional thought was when Saudi Arabia peaks, no one else can actually, the rest of the world peaks. And they peaked in 2019. Right, so let me show you a thought experiment. This is going to bake your noodle. Right, so oil is a proxy for economic development. Yeah? You remember the chart, more oil, more GDP?
Right.
Right, so what if we brought the whole world into line with per capita oil consumption as Germany in the year 2018? Right. Everyone wants to be Germany. Right. And so we would
that's part of the narrative, that the people in the world who currently live on $5 a day want to have the lifestyle of Europeans and Americans, and no doubt they want the relative abundance that we have. But anyway,
watch this for a game of soldiers.
What?
Right. Watch this for a game of soldiers. On the left, the one you see here is world consumption in 1,000 barrels a day per country. So the pale green is rest of the world. Then you got Europe, United States, China, and all the BRICS economies on top of that.
Yeah.
So if the BRICS economies, just the BRICS economies, came into line with Germany per capita, how much people do they have? And if they consume the same amount of oil, how much oil would that be if they were the same as Germany? Right, that's the middle column.
So what has expanded? Oh, China is part of BRICS. India is part of BRICS, and the purple and the green are also part of BRICS.
Russia is green and Brazil is purple.
Okay.
So China has expanded a bit. But look at India. India is the dark horse that's going to scare the hell out of everyone.
Oh yeah, sure.
And so this is the rest of the world. So now we've got the entire world expanding. And they won't have to expand as much as everyone else. The United States will have to decrease by 54% to come into line with Germany. Okay, so here's the funny part.
This shows how much oil consumption would be needed if everybody came in line with the lifestyle of Germany.
Yep,
oil
that's right.
Production per capita of Germany.
So we need an extra 117,000 barrels a day on top of what we have now. Right.
So we need more oil to achieve this, even though oil is declining and limited.
Yep. So let's put a pin in that. So if Saudi Arabian Gawa field, the best that the world's ever seen, it's now producing 3.8 million barrels a day. We know that because Aramco had to quote what it's actually saying when they tried to sell off the company. Right. So we need 31 new Gawa deposits. Right, so let me show you what that means. See this chart here, that really long line there, that's Gawa. We need 31 of those operational and
So
delivering oil.
Gawar is in Saudi Arabia. That must be like a landmark discovery
That
of oil in about the late 40s.
that yeah, 1939, I think it is.
Okay.
In It's the world's largest oil deposit ever seen, of highest quality. It's still running, but I think it's actually peaked and is now declining. But we need 31 of them just to bring into line with the whole world, into line with the German economy in 2018.
So that big tall column there, does that represent the total historic production from Gawar?
No, that represents the size of the deposit as discovered.
Oh, okay. Okay.
So we need 31 of these somehow. And we're at this stage at the right-hand side of the graph. Not going to happen.
Right.
Right, so go back to this. 31 new Gawar deposits just to do that. So we're never going to get to the point where everyone around the world is going to develop the same level of economic equality with the developed parts of the Western world. They're just never going to get there.
This might be naive or obtuse or overgeneralizing, but do we have to equate well-being with energy production or GDP? Is that a perfect correlation? Can we get away from this idea? And I'm not convinced that I don't know, maybe I shouldn't talk because I'm a relatively privileged person in a wealthy country, but I'm not convinced that well-being is tied to GDP or oil consumption.
That's a furious debate, and it's actually the neoclassical model. By the way, I recommend you get hold of Steve Keen and get him to present, because he's possibly one of the best of actually unpacking our economic predicament. And I recommend Art Berman in terms of oil. Right. So this whole idea of GDP and all that, this is all our economic stuff. Economics rules the world. Money's more important than anything else. It doesn't have to be that way. That's the way we're structured now. But if we got to something else like human happiness, that would require a radical reconstruction of our economic and commercialism centers.
Well, there's this concept of, I don't want to get too far off track, but there's this concept of externalities. It's like, Nate Hagen says that the mainstream, he's an economist, he's an ecological economist, and he says mainstream economists count the goods, but not the bads. You count the sale price and the net profits, but you don't count the costs of these activities. So
the question then becomes, should we let these Muppets decide what's best for us?
So you said Muppets before. What do you mean by that? I'm a big fan of Muppets. What do you mean by that?
When I was a wee lad, I used to watch the Muppet Show. Which
me too.
Jim Henson. And so it's a slang term in Australia for when we're actually looking at like clown puppets. Like the clown show, without actually using foul language, we can actually sort of say, these idiots.
Right.
We don't have to use salty language as such, even if we want to.
So what were you going to say about the Muppets? What are the Muppets doing this time?
So the Muppets are like a group that you really don't want to take seriously. Like we shouldn't let these people dictate what is actually necessary for our world, and they're being very exploitive.
These are the cornucopians and the Vikings.
Yeah. So but the very, very wealthy are running our society at the moment for their own benefit, and they're drawing wealth of everyone else, right? And it's exploitive, it's predatory, and very self-serving. And I believe it's a bankrupt methodology. And I think the world will change. And if the current economic systems don't change with us, we will eat them.
If they don't change with us, what?
If they don't change with us in change how we live, because you can sort of see the energy conundrum that we are now in, right? We are not going to dodge this. We can't avoid this. So we have ourselves a serious problem. Either they change with us and then we develop a world worth having, and they cede some of the power they've taken, because so much wealth is concentrated in the hands of so few. But wealth inequality is an all-time high, right? the poor on the world will turn on the rich. And
Okay,
says, no,
yeah.
we ain't having this.
Here's one thing that I don't know if it's my optimistic self or what, but the way I see it, the people, these Muppets that you're talking about, the people at the
Yeah.
top, the very rich who own everything, they call all the shots, they tell the rest of us how it should go. They're going to have less cheap energy to play with.
Yep.
They're going to have much more difficulty reaching all the way around the globe and being hegemonic in terms of military or economics or culture.
All of that is true. So, but they've got a plan, just like we've all got a plan. They've been looking at this for a long time.
Yeah.
Research, if you can, the Great Reset that's coming out of the World Economic Forum. There's been a few books on it. Their plan is a debt reset where all debts are now called in and all assets associated with all debts will be owned by the banking sector. And we, the people, will own nothing because, you know, it's been a debt jubilee. We will have no privacy. We will own nothing, but we'll never be happier. Ho, ho, ho. And so this is their method of social engineering a society where we come through this change, but they maintain their power. So the World Economic Forum has a plan. They recognize some of these problems, for what to do about it, I disagree with.
They have to bribe us with somehow with something. They have to bribe us in order to
bribe, threaten, or we're put into a very desperate situation where we become very susceptible to suggestion. You know, come with us, you know, do what we say, we'll save you. You know, it wasn't us, it was the other guy.
Right. Look, here's an enemy. Here's an enemy that you're supposed to obsess on.
Back to Bill Hicks. Shut up, America. here's 50 channels of American gladiators.
Right.
Yeah.
All right, here we go.
Yep.
We're getting into some serious stuff now. We're talking about, you know, who really controls the world and how's that going to unfold when we run out of cheap energy. Simon's analysis, as well as the analysis of others that I follow and respect, says that we're just going to run out of cheap energy and in the not too distant future. We don't know when, but what are the effects of that going to be? How is that going to unfold?
So I believe we are a good 17 years into when the system is actually
and Simon is wearing his Superman shirt because he's the Superman he has superpowers, and his superpowers is he knows what the heck is going on. And most of the pundits and most of the leaders, politically, business leaders, don't know what's going on, but he's going to tell us what is really going on, not to predict the future, but to know with crystal clarity what the past and the present, you know. So
it's in the coffee. Yeah. So yeah, and so I've been trying to actually map these signatures to try and understand the things that influence everything. Where's it all going? And what are going to be the sore points or the bottlenecks? And if something falls over, what are the downstream effects of that? Now, I like listening to Nicole Foss, or at least I heard this from her first. And then I went away and read some of the biological textbooks that she recommended. But in biology, the size and complexity of a biological organism is directly defined by the energy we put into it. Right. So if that energy reduces even a little, the size has to shrink and the complexity has to shrink. And what we're looking at as a consequence of
think of an organism that is able to eat as much as it wants. It's going to grow bigger than an organism that has a limited amount to eat. And we're saying energy is what this superorganism is eating. Maybe that's a superorganism, but the world economic system is eating energy. And when it has less energy, it's naturally going to shrink in size and complexity.
Yep. And those basic ideas are transferable to any system that uses energy. Now, there's a field called industrial ecology. My friend Bill Reese gets very angry when you use the word industrial ecology because he's an ecologist. He says, get that word out of your mouth.
Yeah, it sounds like a contradiction in terms, because an ecosystem is somewhat circular and sustainable, whereas industrial, by definition, is extractive.
Yes, and that is true. And that is actually Bill's problem with that. And so while I've been studying industrial ecology for a while, I'm trying to think of better words to describe what I mean, because he's absolutely right. And I actually need someone like Bill to finish my work.
So what do you
Right.
mean? Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Bill finished what I started. So what do you mean by industrial ecology, and what are you getting at?
So when I say Bill helped me finish my work, um, let me I'm planning the next 5 years, and in the next 5 years, I've sort of worked out, well, how am I going to do this? Um, you know, what is it do I think I'm doing here? And what I've actually come up with is, let me share my screen. This is the map. Can you see that?
Yes,
Okay, so this here, I'm operating
I
in
can
that
see
black.
the diagram, but I can't see the little things that are written in it.
Okay, I'll read you to them then.
Okay.
So we're looking at a 3-point system. In the middle, we've got a sustainable human civilization post fossil fuels. That's where we want to get. The black circle in the top right-hand side is industrial system, raw materials, and energy. That's my work. But it's recognized, and the red saying the subject of this report, this is recognizing that my work is only a part of what's needed. I need someone from the environmental movement who understands ecology, like Bill, and I've already asked him this, but he hasn't answered me on this one. I need someone to work out an equivalent piece of work of how we should interact with the planetary environment. Right, and the top left-hand corner is this is new society social contract. And I need someone from the social sciences to do an equivalent piece of work in the social sciences based on what we see in my work and in the planetary environment work. Now, my work in the industrial era is not the social contract. And the social contract is not the interaction with the environment. And the interaction with the environment is not the industrial system.
So the social contract is like this. Hey, we've been told all our lives we live in a democracy. That should mean that the public will works itself into public policy. So can we talk about what kind of society we want? Can we talk about what our agreements will be, what our arrangements will be, and can we decide what that's going to be instead of just inertia?
Yep, that's right. Because how much of our existing system has been corrupted, right? How much of it is subject to illusion, and people have lost faith in all of it, right? But also all previous social contracts, communism, capitalism, fascism, feudalism, they've all been based on some kind of growth or expansion, whether it's profit or conquest. Whatever we come up
And that
with
would
next.
explain why empires grow and then they fall.
Yep.
All empires, all civilizations, like 33 or so, have fallen.
That's right. You've nailed it. So whatever we come up with next has got to be an unprecedented social contract, because we can't do growth anymore. We've got to do something else. And we either help each other or we turn on each other. And, we all, what do we want? So the 3 points.
You have to ask yourself what's growing. Is the well-being of the average person growing? Is the well-being of our ecology growing? Or is it just the bank accounts of the people who are in charge and get to call the shots?
That's growing, and possibly their ego as well. So the 3 points of the triangle will come together. And once we've got all 3 points together, we can now move into the center. So the industrial system is the sustainable civilization post-fossil fuels. Interaction with the planetary environment is the sustainable human civilization. The new social contract is the sustainable civilization post-fossil fuels. Right, so this is the map I put together to understand my place in the world and to recognize I need help. I'm going to do my thing, but I need some partners who actually are going to do their thing, and they've got to understand what I've put together, and I've got to understand what they do.
One thing, I watched Nate Hagen's interview with Bill Reese, and Bill, he's a wonderful guy, very knowledgeable, all the positive energy you can expect from a person, and yet he is he is not optimistic in terms of what we're willing to do, the adjustments that we would be willing to make voluntarily. He thinks the crap is going to hit the fan, and you know, the system that we have has so much momentum, it's just not going to turn around.
So there is a school of thought to that, and there is a lot of suggestion for that. I'm putting forward the idea that we can actually use technology to come through this. I'm putting forward the idea that this is going to be the most difficult period in human history, but it's contingent on us removing the self-serving leadership issues. So Bill basically believes we've already passed the point of no return, right? And which means the system will now correct itself and find a new equilibrium. And the first thing to take a bullet will be the stock market, right? He may well be correct. And so no one actually knows how this is going to go, right? And so we can only do our best with what we have. I believe that at least some of humanity will come through this. So I'm trying to talk to who are they and what do they do and what do they achieve?
Okay, so you've talked about like there are like 7 things that we need to take care of. We need to have food in relative abundance. We need to have clean water. We need to have sewage. We need to have you know, a few other things, and so our success will depend on how we take care of those individual systems.
So let me show you my website, because in that website, I'm actually, I've actually sort of put together a, okay, can you see the website that's up?
Yes.
Okay, so this is all my work. Now, this is what I believe. This is what I believe. We're very tribal. We're very tribal. I'm not here to follow the paths of others. I'm here to make my own, right? And so then they're my footprints in a place called Rainbow Beach in Australia. This is the different groups, different sectors I'm working in or trying to understand.
I'm going to read them out loud. You got fiat currency reset, peak fossil fuels, earth dynamic system stress, industrial agriculture challenges, self-serving leadership, mineral supply, manufacture challenges, and population overshoot. Those are and at the center of it is, what do we do?
Do we just roll over and die? Is this all too much? Do we just laugh ourselves to death? So each one of those issues is a problem, and each of them needs to be met and understood. None of them means that every single human being will die.
Right.
What it will mean is the systems that we actually sort of depend on at the moment will become difficult. And now that we're losing energy, energy is the source of everything, and we're in the process of replacing our energy into something else. So Earth's dynamic systems, that's actually, and each one of these is a button that will go to another page. None of that's been done yet. But Earth dynamic systems is everything planet. So it is not just what we call climate change, it is also all the patterns that we're actually sort of seeing that the system's in stress. Yeah, that's your species die-off stuff. And that's the overloading of the phosphorus cycle and all that. The self-serving leadership down the bottom is best represented at the moment by the World Economic Forum and the banking sector. Right? And they represent possibly the worst humanity has to offer. Are we really going to let those guys and gals, to decide how our world will be? And this is, I put this on every presentation. The presentation that went to the IMF and the one I'm presenting at the UN next week has that in the final end. We need a new plan. We need a new plan. And can we please have an adult conversation about this?
Right. Right. Well, what characterizes our non-adult like conversations? You know, hostility, childishness, lack of responsibility.
Yep. Self-serving behavior, manipulation, emotional blackmail, deceit, anger, shame, guilt, all the high maintenance stuff that we experience on a individual level is happening at a socially species level.
I like saying that, as a species, one of our conformism, like going with the flow, getting those social signals from your peers and going with the flow is probably a major reason for our success as a species. It's also a reason, it's an Achilles heel. It's like so many people are good, really good at conforming and going with the flow. And part of that is being triggered by a perceived enemy, letting somebody decide who your enemy is, who is the bad guy, who's the scapegoat, that we're going to stop what we're doing and focus on this scapegoat. And we're not really seeing who is taking advantage of us.
Yeah. So that's one of the things we've actually got to, how much do we actually see of corruption and deceit and illusion that is really tearing apart the social fabric of society, when really we should be, and it's preventing us from coming together in large enough numbers to have a discussion about what's really happening and then demand change from our democratically elected leaders.
Mm-hmm.
In a French Revolution, get on with it or we're going to replace your ass.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So, and you could also sort of argue that this actually suits everyone very well, because it's like the entire species has been walked to the edge of the pier and then told, oh, we're sorry, it's all terrible, isn't it? And so there'll be a change of government and the new government comes in, we'll make the hard decisions now. But
Mm-hmm.
but humanity is now at the edge of the pier. Do we fall in? And so, or do we accept and become susceptible to untenable, to things that we would not accept normally?
Well, one thing that you're articulating, the concepts you're articulating and the concerns you're expressing does not fit neatly into the two major parties in the US.
Nope. Or anywhere else.
There's this third grade, like left and right are becoming increasingly irrelevant. It's more like you, and I don't want to oversimplify, but people who call themselves on the left and call themselves on the right, if they see these power structures for what they are, then they have a conversation going. If you don't see those power structures for what they are, then that's a whole, you probably, not going to have much in common with these people who are critiquing both corporate power and governmental power, as well as, economic power and cultural institutions, et cetera.
But consider the following. We're now going to model the world based on a proposition that we think the world is a democratically run series of societies, right? But that is being presented to us as an illusion. What's really happening is the world is run by a series of criminal oligarchs.
Yes, exactly.
Who are there harvesting wealth of everyone else for their own self-benefit. Right. And so what we've got is a two-party system all over the world. It's either one party or the other.
Mm-hmm.
But in reality, because both parties are beholden to the same interest groups and are funded by the same people, no less, you've actually got one party with two acting troops.
Right.
And they've been around for a long time now that they're starting to cooperate as such. When the Democrats are in, they'll do a series of things that Democrats do. Oh, that's terrible. The Republicans come in.
Mm-hmm.
They'll do a series of things, right, that they always do. But the actions of both parties happen to help each other along, where certain things on the surface are moved around, like the deck chairs on the Titanic, but underneath, the war party is always resourced.
Right.
The banking party is always resourced. Nothing ever actually changes. That cartoon Tom and Jerry?
Yeah.
The cat chasing the rat. What happens if the cat catches the rat and eats it? Right?
No, you don't have a cartoon anymore.
No, the game is over. It's the same thing in politics, which is why the other party never actually fixes anything. It's always a chase.
That's part of the reason we have these cultural issues that, abortion, gun rights, what else? Gay marriage, LGBTQ issues, which are all important, but they're also somewhat unresolvable. And, both parties take advantage of this kind of contrived controversy In the Nixon era, it was called the Southern Strategy, and I think the Clintons used it as well. But using cultural issues to divide people, I think that the
Yep.
ruling class, historically over the course of time, the ruling class is demonstrably skilled at
Yep.
keeping us divided. Martin Luther King talked about this. Vandana Shiva talks about this. But they figure out ways to keep us divided so that our energies are dedicated to this conflict among us little people instead of getting at the real source of the problems.
Wouldn't it be remarkable to talk to Dr. King in person for a period of time? That would be cool. So what you're referring to is when you see it from the outside, like I'm not in America and I was from Australia. I'm not part of the American system. Right. But recently we had a situation where both sides of the political divide were antagonized at the same time and then pointed at each other. The left was antagonized by the Supreme Court overturning a ruling on abortion.
Yeah.
That ruling was somehow leaked, and it was leaked in a timing to antagonize people, then to get them organized to the point where they can actually then have some sort of political activism. At the same time, the group we call the right, the more conservative, they were antagonized by sorts of things that would antagonize them in particular. And what I was seeing at the time is they had all these preschools that actually had these trans people will like a trans activist will come and read them stories, but they're dressed up like a sex worker. And the names, they're calling names like Little Hot Mess. And that really made in a conservative area, and that made the conservative people really angry. And so then both groups at the same time in the same 8-day cycle were antagonized, and then they were pointed at each other. Right. And so it was a strategy. I believe it was a strategy to try and antagonize people to influence an election.
They call it weapons of mass distraction.
Yeah. And so a lot of the social contract has been weaponized against us. But I believe the people doing that don't understand human empathy. Like anger and hate can only be sustained for a relatively short period of time if you don't have other things to go with it. And they were not, the people who were doing this were not able to bring to bear enough actions soon enough. Right. And so now a large portion of people are starting to see what's being discussed here for what it really is. And once enough people see that, it's not going to work anymore. Right. And I think so there is a book called The Fourth Turning. If you haven't seen it, I recommend it.
Let me say something real quick, and that is, as I look to the future based on your analysis and the running out of energy and the, kind of a societal crisis, I think the two things that concern me most, the two problems that need to be solved in order for most people to thrive, and one is food, and the other is war, or more generally just conflict, how we are pitted against one another, and we don't tend to work together when we're pitted against one another. But the facility and the ease with which the ruling class pits us against one another on false premises is, I guess, one of my two main concerns.
So wars, the people who actually fight wars very rarely actually want to do it. Right, but they've been enraged and wrangled, and often on false pretenses. Like the war in Iraq in 2003 was based on weapons of mass destruction that were proven later not to exist, and they knew it wasn't exist. But no one has so much as lost their job over that.
I know.
The Vietnam War was based on the Gulf of Tonkin incident.
Yes.
Right, and they've now since admitted that it never happened. Right. So. Why were the wars fought?
And it's not often discussed. Those are the two things that you've just told me about. I've learned within the past 5 years, because it's not discussed often enough in our education system or in our media for it to sink in and be internalized. What does this really mean?
So let me do a segue here, because my stepdaughter is doing education in Finland, and they're teaching these kids ethics in school. ethics and morals. It's a subject.
Mhm.
And now they're doing a subject which they're playing a geopolitical simulation where there's 5 fictitious countries. Some are rich, some are poor. Each country is run by 4 kids. And so, right, yeah, you run the military, I'll run the economy, so on like that. And they each have to make decisions on how they interact with each other. And they run that simulation for a couple of days. And so it's the equivalent of like Risk and Empires of how
Mhm.
countries interact with each other and how things can go wrong. I never saw that when I was a kid.
Mm-mm.
So, which is why I think certain things are possible in Finland that are not possible elsewhere because of things like that in their
So that
education system.
that game, I'm sure there are many different types of games like that which teach you a skill and an experience. And wouldn't it be great if we had that experience so that we could better not only think about things and analyze what public policy should be, but also we have more of the skills that we need to interact in our community and build things that are worthwhile.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. And so how are people educated? Like George Orwell, um, there was a quote from George Orwell, which no, about George Orwell and Aldous Huxley. By the way, they knew each other, which was interesting. And so, where is it? Here it is. Here, what Orwell feared were
Mhm.
those who would ban books.
Mhm.
What Huxley feared was there would be no reason to ban a book. George Orwell wrote 1984.
Right.
Aldous Huxley wrote A
Brave New
Brave New
World.
World. Yeah. So Huxley feared there'd be no reason to ban the book, for there'd be no one wanting to read one. Orwell feared those who would deprive us of information. Huxley feared that those who would give us so much that we would be reduced to passivity and egoism. Orwell feared the truth would be concealed from us. Huxley feared the truth would be drowned in a sea of irrelevance.
And
Orwell, yeah, sorry, yeah.
yeah, both of those are, Orwell and Huxley, both are prescient. Huxley seems a bit more I mean, 1984 is just brilliant, and I'm prescient, and I think 1984 is right on target. Is just kind of astounding how many words have crept into our language, like
Yeah.
groupthink and doublethink and Big
Fake
Brother and that
news.
kind of thing. But
2 minutes of hate.
Aldous Huxley seemed to describe a situation where you can find information if you want to, but you kind of have to go out of your way because we're in a flood. We're just flooded with information and entertainment. And the
So
things
see,
I've
yeah,
learned in the last 5 years, I went out of my way a little bit,
yeah.
and it just was never part of our culture or media or schools.
So see 1984 as the beginning of the process, and Brave New World is the end of the process.
Mm.
Right. So
Well, the
they
thing is,
both are
okay,
relevant.
so 1984 and Animal Farm, I read both of them multiple times in my education. They were assigned, and it was always understood that these were about totalitarian
Yep.
countries like the Soviet Union. It was
Yep.
understood that this is not us because we live in freedom. But then, fast forward, and it's like, what Noam Chomsky talks about, the totalitarian regimes can control you by force, but ostensibly democratic countries have to control what you think.
And we're seeing a lot of that now. And so my question back to what we were discussing earlier, how does a small number of people keep in place and control a large number of people to accept crushing austerity measures and now food shortages, when
Mhm.
it will become apparent that the people in charge knew this was a problem decades ago and did nothing?
So let's talk about the consent of the governed. John Locke, yeah, I'm getting this through Noam Chomsky, but Chomsky says that John Locke talked about how the only way people, there are a lot of people who are governed, and there are a few people who are doing the governing. The only way they can accomplish that is through consent, which I think comes through ideology. right? We
Yeah.
have these belief systems, and and so because of those belief systems, like American exceptionalism or a supposedly free market, that kind of thing, we go with the flow, and anyway, it's through consent. We could rebel if we wanted to, but we don't want to because we think that what we're doing is good for us and good for everybody.
So, yeah. And so what we're talking about here is an evolution. Here's a question for you. How often across your life, especially when you're younger, like you're older and wiser now, we both are. When we're both young, what I used to call was I really that stupid when I observed the young? So when we're both young, how often did you and I do things because we thought someone else would like us for it, or someone else would like us to do it, as opposed to us wanting to do it because we thought it was the right thing to do, or we actually wanted to?
Right.
Right. And so how often is the average person influenced in what to think, what to believe, and what to do, both as individuals and now as like in groups, like groupthink? I think the human herd, if you will, has been put in a situation where what we believe has been hacked and edited, and we're being pushed in pertinent, and which is why today so many important things are happening around us, but we can't even agree on what the data is. Right. And so it's belief. It's belief first about what data is real. And we'll fight each other like rats in a cage, like Chris Martenson suggests, instead of going after the people that put us in this situation.
Right. Well, Matt Taibbi, famous journalist now, wrote kind of an updated version of Manufacturing Consent, which he calls Hate Inc. or Hate Incorporated. It's like, what is the political economy of the mass media? How does the mass media really work? On the front of the book, Hate Incorporated, he has Sean Hannity of Fox News and MSNBC, Rachel Maddow, kind of flip sides of the same coin. The subtitle is How the Media Make Us Hate Each Other. That's the subtitle of it. You have this tribe, you have Tribe Democrat and all the media that's aligned with them. You have Tribe Republican and all the media that's aligned with him. And they don't really, if you're in one group or another, you don't really hear what the other group says. And media, like news, is a consumer product. You're taking a break and looking at news on your phone in the same way that you might have taken a smoke break. You're getting a dopamine hit from that. You're watching the news and you kind of see yourself in a story. You're part of a tribe. There's good guys and there's bad guys.
Yeah. So I felt intuitively about 15 years ago that there's something wasn't quite right. What we're talking about, that tribal thing, the Hannitys and the Maddows and the Australian equivalent, they were there. And I was starting to discern a pattern of what they were suggesting I should think and feel. And there was a cycle, about a 7 or 8 week cycle. And then they would reset and go, oh, hang on a minute. And I couldn't quite put my finger on it. And so I started sort of, as you say, go out of my way to find certain information. And I tried to debate with some of the guys I went to school with at the time. And they were most displeased with some of my ideas. They wouldn't have it at all. But also at the time, because I was dealing with an intuition, finding the information to actually describe what I was picking up on.
So every 7 or 8 weeks, what would happen?
It was a better way to describe it is as, do you remember when Trump was running for president in 2016? And Trump's a master of reality TV. And okay, he might be a buffoon and a bully, but he's not stupid.
Right.
And so something would be leaked. The pattern would be this: something would come out that Trump has done something unfortunate, and the media that was against him, because Trump was an outsider, and that was the problem. He wasn't established, so they must kill him. The media would make a lot of action about, this is terrible, and they would have a lot of hoopla around the scandal. But about 9 days later, because there's an 8 to 10 day window of when the public have just about had enough and they need to move on to the other thing, unless they're given new information. at around the 8th or 9th day, it would then come out that his political opponent had done exactly the same thing, but worse.
Mm-hmm.
And in the beginning, Trump and in the beginning, Trump said, "Yeah, I did it. Sorry. Yeah, I am what I am. Suck it up." And now, and his opponents would fall for it every time. And it was a cycle that seemed to go for 8, 9, maybe 10 days.
Mm-hmm.
And it was one scandal after another, after another. And so people got hardened into the point where they believe, this is what Trump does. We're not, that, we're not that worried by that. But he made his opponents look really corrupt because he was manipulating the media cycle.
Right.
And you see that. And once
He's
you
a
actually
master of drawing attention to himself. He spent how many years on reality TV?
Yep. And so so that was just like you saw it again in cycles and cycles and cycles. And then you would often sort of see in the alternative media that we've been seeing for the last little while, a prediction in 4 or 5 weeks' time, the economic system's going to crash. And I go, right, and you put in your diary 4 or 5 time, okay, and so then that would all disappear on week 2 or 3, and then another prediction would come out. And so it's like, what is the attention span of the average person? How do we collect information? What do we do with it? Now, this is very we humans have been studied since the 50s of what we would do in stressful situations, and some of that research has been quite unethical.
Okay, question. You're describing a process whereby the public's attention is captured. How much and is that intentional, and how much of it is systemic?
It depends on how cynical you are. The answer is a large proportion of both, I suppose. Some of it will be systemic because this is how we are. This is and the natural function of the mainstream media is to make a lot of money with scandal. If it bleeds, it leads. There is an element of truth to all that. Then there is the case of all those YouTube videos where someone's actually taken 50 or 60 different media talking heads and they've overlaid them, and so
and they're saying the same things,
right? And so you can hear
phrases, same phrases,
and so that tells you that their talking points come from a central point, and they all get them all at the same time. And so the media is not the media anymore. And so if they're the ones that are actually controlling public attention, but they're getting information from a centralized point, what does that imply? And so we've now moved out of the industrial.
I was trying to think of the name of the videographer who's really good at capturing those things. Matt Orfalea is a videographer who's really good at capturing those. Here's the people saying the same thing. One instance of it was according to Republicans, the 2020 election is not legitimate. According to Democrats, the 2016 election is not legitimate. And all this posturing and virtue signaling about, Democrats today are accusing Republicans of doing exactly what they did in including Hillary Clinton. This is not a legitimate president, that kind of thing.
So,
that's a little bit different from what you're saying, though, which is
same principle.
Okay.
Same principle, different tool. But what that means is 8 years have passed. Nothing's actually changed.
Right.
And humanity at large has been walked a little bit closer to the edge of the pier. And when
during the Trump era, you ask even to today, but during the Trump era, you would ask a Democrat what needs to change. It's like Trump. All you have to do is change Trump, and all our problems are solved.
What's interesting, never mind what political stripe you happen to like, go and sit down with a group of hardcore Democrats, and you say a series of words. The first one's Trump, and there's a series of trigger words, and it doesn't matter if the words fit together in a sentence. They get very angry.
Oh,
very, very angry. But the same is also true with the political alternative. It's like we've been conditioned to get very emotional, and aggressive, on certain topics. And so The
So
conclusion of
those
my,
trigger words, there's a type of that is analogous to, and I think related to, hypnosis.
Hmm.
And hypnosis can be used to, it can be structured such that the target or the subject or the patient gets triggered by certain words and they go into a certain state.
right,
Who knows how much of that is calculated, but I think what is calculated is keeping the public off balance.
right. So what we've been discussing about for the last 30 minutes is a different flavor to what we discussed an hour ago, right? But if certain members of your audience were to hear this conversation, if they're not already seeing this information, they will be emotionally triggered and get very angry by what we're
Exactly.
suggesting. But even though it's fairly easy to demonstrate that this stuff is true, all right?
I
So
like the analogy of red pill and blue pill. It's from the Matrix. It's like red pill, blue pill is kind of somebody who's in the Matrix and
yep,
doesn't
and
really
likes it.
see the Matrix for what it is. Red pill is somebody who's outside the Matrix and can see it for what it is. Then it's the kind of like, some of us like to think of ourselves as red pill. And then the blue pill people are going to get triggered if they hear something that's outside their comfort zone and it's outside their understanding of the truth.
Yeah. So and so a lot of the concepts that we're discussing are actually very challenging, and people don't like being challenged in that way. So the conclusion
And
of
some
my
of that,
work,
like Tom Murphy has this, the Myers-Briggs breakdown. I think I'm an INTJ. It's like 1/16 of the Myers-Briggs thing. Tom Murphy has identified two groups, and 1/8 of the total Myers-Briggs matrix constitutes 75% of his audience, which indicates that there are certain people who are strongly inclined to think that, and it tends to be people that are intuitive for one thing, but some people are strongly inclined to think something is wrong, and let's talk about what's wrong and how we can build a better future, that kind of thing. And then the rest of people are more inclined to go with the flow.
so when I went for a job interview in the mining industry about 10, 15 years ago, this is in the corporate world, and they love these psychological profiles. And one of them was for a company called BHP. And for 6 hours, I was going through mathematics tests and language tests and logic tests. But then they had a psych evaluation, and they were deadly serious about this. And they get you to write answer like all these questions that seem erroneous. And the answers to the questions are actually not important.
Right.
How you answer them,
How you answer them.
puts you in a certain grouping in the Myers-Briggs outcomes. Is all right. But what they came up with me was a little interesting, is that you've actually got two classifications, right? 20% of the time, you're an ENTJ. 80% of the time, you're an INTJ. And every now and then you change gears.
Uh-huh.
And that is how I'm actually able to do this deep cycle analysis stuff, but then climb on the stage and get, eggs and rocks thrown at me and actually sort of being able to sort of present it and discuss it. And that's how I'm actually able to function.
Right.
But
One thing this reminds me of is, I'm not sure if you've read like Confessions of an Economic Hitman.
yes,
John
excellent book.
Perkins.
Excellent
So,
book.
an important part of his biography is that early on, like when he was graduating from college, he did interviews with the NSA, National Security Agency, otherwise known, used to be called no such agency because it was so secretive. But he did interviews and psych evaluations with the NSA, and they identified that they figured out what his buttons were, and they said, "You're our kind of guy," because for one thing, he was shy around women. He was angry at he'd gone to a boarding school where his father was a teacher, but the boarding school, most of the kids were just these fabulously wealthy kids, and he was jealous of them and angry at them. And he wanted money, and he wanted success with women, and he was angry. And they figured all that out, and they said, "You might not work with the NSA, but you're going to work for some company that works with the NSA." And he ended up going to Charles T. Maine and really becoming an instrument of the empire because of what they found. And the fact that it was the Vietnam War at the time, the fact that he was opposed to the Vietnam War, they didn't care.
Yeah. That's
They
exactly
knew he
right.
was going to be a tool in their toolbox.
Yep. And so to as they say in the business, he fit a profile. And then,
Mm-hmm.
so there is several books which I like to quote. One is Confessions of an Economic Hitman.
Mm-hmm.
The other is The Shock Doctrine by Naomi Klein.
Yeah.
The other is The Fourth Turning. I can't
Hmm.
remember the author offhand. The other is The Thucydides Trap.
Hmm.
And like, will China and the United States go to war or not? Very interesting book. And what was the other one? Can't remember off the top of my head, but there's a series of books, and there's only 4 or 5 of them, but they are so very nice of actually describing the way the system used to work and how it responds, along with what's going to break, which will diagnose what's coming next. Yeah. Anyway, so where would you like to go next? And I need to sign off because it's almost dinner time.
Yeah, that's fine. It's been wonderful. More
Yeah.
than I bargained for. We can continue this conversation in the future if you want to.
Yeah, sure. Happy to.
Thank you so much. So my guest has been Simon Michaux of he's associate professor of Geological Survey of Finland and PhD in mining engineering. He's wearing a Superman shirt because he has superpowers, and his superpowers are knowing how the world really works. All right, Simon, thank you. Have a great day.
Okay, you too.
Keep up the great, fantastic work.
I will.
Okay.
You too.